The hardest person to face is never the one who ruined your life. It's the one who walks back through your door after you've finally learned to live without them. The smell of fresh bread drifted onto Maple Street just as the first rays of morning settled across the cracked brick buildings, wrapping the old neighborhood in a quiet warmth it had almost forgotten. Ava Brooks stood behind the polished oak counter of a bakery that had been abandoned for nearly 12 years, her fingers brushing across its smooth surface as though she needed to remind herself it was finally real. Every shelf, every light fixture, every painted wall had been restored by her own hands after months of 14-hour days and countless sleepless nights. She had sold her car, emptied her savings account, worked double shifts in diners across Chicago, and spent every spare dollar bringing life back into a place everyone else believed was beyond saving. The faded sign above the entrance now read Brooks Bakery in elegant cream-colored lettering, simple enough that no one would ever guess how much pain those two words contained. A brass bell chimed softly as she unlocked the front door for the very first customer. Outside, the sidewalks were still quiet except for a retired mail carrier walking his golden retriever and an elderly couple carrying paper cups of coffee. Ava adjusted the white apron around her waist, smoothed a loose curl back beneath her headscarf, and lined up the morning pastries with careful precision. Cinnamon rolls still steamed from the oven. Butter croissants shimmered beneath a thin glaze. Apple turnovers released the comforting scent of brown sugar and cinnamon that reminded her of Sunday mornings with her grandmother. She smiled to herself for the first time all morning. Maybe starting over really was possible. Then the bell rang again. A man stepped inside wearing a charcoal overcoat despite the mild spring weather. He paused just beyond the doorway, removing a pair of black leather gloves with slow, deliberate movements before his eyes wandered across the display cases. There was nothing loud about him, nothing dramatic, yet the entire room seemed to grow quieter. The moment he entered, Ava reached automatically for a menu. "Good morning," she said with the calm warmth she had practiced in front of a mirror for weeks. "Welcome to Brooks Bakery." The man lifted his eyes. Time stopped. Daniel Kong recognized her before she could even lower the menu. 3 years disappeared in a heartbeat. The same steady brown eyes. The same quiet confidence hidden beneath exhaustion. The same woman he had dismissed with a single sentence without ever asking for her side of the story. Ava felt the air leave her lungs, but only for an instant. Years of rebuilding herself had taught her that some storms deserved no reaction. She offered the same gentle smile she would have given any stranger. "What can I get started for you today, sir?" Daniel said nothing. His gaze drifted toward a loaf of rustic sourdough resting beside a golden honey oat bowl, then toward a framed photograph hanging behind the register. It showed Ava standing in front of the empty building months earlier, covered in flour, dust, and paint, smiling beside a handwritten sign that simply read, "Coming soon." His expression softened in a way she had never seen before. "You own this place?" he finally asked, his voice quieter than she remembered. Ava nodded once. "Yes." Another silence settled between them, filled only by the gentle hum of the ovens and the distant whistle of a passing train. Daniel looked around the bakery again, noticing handwritten notes taped beside a community bulletin board offering free bread every Friday for seniors, discounted lunches for teachers, and coffee on the house for first responders. Nothing about the room suggested wealth. Everything about it reflected care. He turned back toward the display case and pointed at a simple country loaf. "I'll take that one." Ava wrapped the bread carefully in brown paper, folded the edges with practiced hands, and placed it gently on the counter. "That'll be $6, she said with the same polite smile, as though the man standing in front of her had never changed the course of her life at all. For the first time in years, Daniel Kong realized that forgiveness might be the one thing money, influence, and power could never buy. Daniel carried the warm loaf out to his car, but instead of driving away, he sat behind the wheel with both hands resting quietly on the paper bag as the aroma of fresh bread filled the cabin. It was the same recipe. He would have recognized it anywhere. 3 years earlier, every executive dinner hosted by his restaurant group had ended with that unmistakable country loaf served alongside whipped honey butter. Customers had praised it. Food critics had written about it. Investors had requested it by name. Yet he had never once bothered to learn who created it. At the time, Ava Brooks had simply been another employee in a spotless white chef coat moving silently through the kitchen before sunrise, while everyone else accepted the praise. Back then, Daniel believed efficiency mattered more than stories. Results mattered more than people. The restaurants were expanding across the Midwest, and every decision was measured by numbers, schedules, and reputation. Then one afternoon, a shipment of specialty ingredients disappeared before a major charity banquet. Managers argued. Supervisors blamed one another. Financial reports did not match inventory records. Someone insisted Ava had signed the receiving documents, and the accusation spread through the kitchen before she even understood what had happened. Daniel arrived only after the internal investigation had already reached his desk. He skimmed the reports, listened to senior managers he trusted, and reached a conclusion in less than 10 minutes. Ava stood quietly in his office, her apron still dusted with flour from the afternoon baking shift. She remembered every detail of that room, from the polished walnut desk to the skyline stretching beyond the floor to ceiling windows. She had tried to explain that the signatures were incomplete, that deliveries changed after her shift ended, and that someone else had access to the storage room. Daniel barely looked up from the folder before speaking the words that shattered everything she had worked toward. Your employment ends today. There was no anger in his voice. Somehow that made it hurt even more. It sounded like reading tomorrow's weather. Ava gathered her knives from the kitchen without arguing. Several co-workers lowered their eyes in sympathy, while others simply assumed the reports had been accurate. She walked through the employee entrance carrying one cardboard box that contained her apron, 2 cookbooks filled with handwritten notes from culinary school, and a faded photograph of her late grandmother teaching her how to knead bread on a tiny kitchen table. She never looked back. The months that followed became a quiet lesson in survival. She accepted overnight shifts at a 24-hour diner where truck drivers appreciated homemade biscuits more than elegant presentation. During afternoons, she catered birthday parties. On weekends, she taught free baking classes at a neighborhood community center in exchange for access to their kitchen. Every paycheck went into a small glass jar labeled bakery. Friends suggested she move on from baking altogether, but Ava refused. Bread had never betrayed her. People had. Every evening before locking the community kitchen, she wrote one sentence inside a worn notebook. Not about money, not about success, only about the kind of bakery she hoped to build someday. A place where nobody would be judged by titles, mistakes, or rumors. A place where every customer would feel seen before they were served. Sitting alone inside his parked car, Daniel slowly unfolded the brown paper around the loaf and tore away a small piece. The first bite carried him back to a decision he had never questioned until this morning. For the first time in years, certainty gave way to doubt, and the memory of one quiet woman leaving without defending herself suddenly felt far heavier than any business mistake he had ever made. The next morning arrived with a gentle spring rain that tapped softly against the bakery windows, turning Maple Street into a watercolor of umbrellas, reflections, and quiet footsteps. Ava unlocked the front door before sunrise, just as she had promised herself she would every single day. The neighborhood was beginning to wake, and she believed people deserved the comforting smell of fresh bread before they faced whatever burdens the day might bring. She tied on her apron, measured flour with practiced hands, and listened to the familiar rhythm of dough meeting the wooden table. There was peace in repetition. Every loaf carried the same careful attention her grandmother had taught her decades ago. Never rush bread, because people can always taste impatience. By 7 o'clock, the bakery had welcomed teachers on their way to school, construction workers picking up breakfast sandwiches, nurses finishing overnight hospital shifts, and retired neighbors who lingered over coffee simply because someone remembered their names. Ava greeted every customer with the same warmth, quietly slipping an extra dinner roll into the bags of anyone who counted coins before paying. She never mentioned it, and most people pretended not to notice. Across the street, a young mother hesitated outside with 2 small children, clearly debating whether she could afford breakfast. Before she could turn away, Ava opened the door and smiled. Today is our grand opening. The cinnamon muffins are complimentary for first-time visitors. The mother's eyes filled with grateful surprise, and the little boy hugged the warm paper bag as though it contained something priceless. Moments like that reminded Ava why she had never abandoned her dream. She had not opened a bakery to become successful. She had opened one because kindness needed a permanent address. Meanwhile, several blocks away, Daniel found himself unable to concentrate during a morning meeting that normally demanded his complete attention. Executives discussed expansion plans, financial projections, and renovation schedules, but every chart on the conference room screen blurred together behind the memory of Ava standing calmly behind that bakery counter. She had shown no resentment, no bitterness, and no attempt to embarrass him. Somehow that quiet dignity unsettled him far more than anger ever could. When the meeting finally ended, he instructed his assistant to cancel his afternoon appointments. Instead of returning to headquarters, he walked through the neighborhood alone, without security, without assistance, and without the polished routine that usually surrounded him. He stopped outside the bakery once again, watching through the large front window as Ava laughed gently with an elderly customer while helping him carry 2 fresh pies to the door. She noticed the man's hands trembling slightly from age and carefully adjusted the box so he could hold it more comfortably. There was nothing performative about the gesture. She acted as though no one was watching. Daniel remained outside for several quiet moments before stepping inside once more. This time the bakery was filled with conversation, children pointing excitedly at colorful cookies, and the comforting sound of fresh coffee being poured into ceramic mugs. Ava looked up briefly, recognizing him immediately, yet her expression remained exactly the same as it had earlier that morning. Calm, professional, unshaken. Daniel approached the counter, studying the handwritten chalkboard menu before speaking. I would like another loaf of the country bread. Ava nodded politely as she wrapped the warm loaf in fresh brown paper. As she handed it across the counter, Daniel noticed a small inscription stamped beneath the bakery logo. It read, "Everyone deserves a fresh start." His fingers rested on those words a moment longer than necessary, and for reasons he could not fully explain, they felt less like a slogan and more like a truth he had been avoiding for far too long. Daniel returned every morning that week, always arriving just after the first wave of customers had left and just before the lunch crowd filled the bakery. He never stayed long. He ordered a different loaf each visit, thanked Ava politely, and walked back onto Maple Street carrying nothing more than warm bread and unanswered questions. The routine should have felt ordinary, yet neither of them could ignore the quiet weight hanging between every exchange. Ava had learned years ago that some conversations only reopened wounds that had already taken too much time to heal. She focused instead on measuring flour, greeting neighbors by name, and building the life she had promised herself. Daniel, however, found silence far more difficult. Every visit revealed another detail he had somehow overlooked. One afternoon he noticed a handwritten notebook resting beside the cash register. Customers were invited to write anonymous requests if they needed help with groceries, rent, school supplies, or simply someone to talk to over coffee. There was no donation box asking for recognition, no photographs celebrating generosity, only quiet acts of kindness woven naturally into the bakery's daily rhythm. While waiting for his order, Daniel watched Ava greet an elderly Army veteran who apologized for being a few dollars short. Without hesitation, she removed one of the pastries from the receipt, adjusted the total, and slid the pastry back into the bag before handing it to him with a warm smile. "You forgot your favorite apple turnover," she said gently. The older man looked confused for a second before understanding what she had done. He nodded gratefully without another word, preserving his dignity as carefully as she had protected it. Daniel noticed something else. She never looked around to see whether anyone had witnessed the gesture. She simply returned to shaping dough as though kindness required no audience. Later that afternoon, as rain clouds drifted across the Chicago skyline, Daniel remained seated at a small corner table with a cup of black coffee he had barely touched. Through the front window, he watched children laughing as they hurried home from school, while the bakery glowed with warm amber light against the gray afternoon. A framed newspaper clipping hanging near the entrance finally caught his attention. It featured the restored building shortly before reopening. The article described how the owner had refused offers from developers who wanted to convert the property into luxury retail space because she believed the neighborhood deserved a gathering place instead of another expensive storefront. There was no mention of her previous career, no attempt to impress readers with past accomplishments. Only one sentence stood out. "A bakery should feed hope before it feeds hunger." Daniel read those words twice before quietly folding the newspaper back into place. As he approached the counter to leave, he hesitated for the first time. "Your bakery is already becoming important to this neighborhood," he said sincerely. Ava finished wrapping another loaf before meeting his eyes. "The neighborhood was important long before I arrived. I simply listened to what it needed." Daniel lowered his gaze, absorbing the quiet wisdom behind her answer. He realized that while he had spent years building successful businesses, Ava had spent those same years building trust. One could be purchased with investment. The other had to be earned one thoughtful moment at a time. As the bell above the door chimed behind him, Daniel stepped back onto the sidewalk, carrying his bread once again. But this time he also carried an uncomfortable realization. The woman he had once dismissed had quietly become everything he had hoped his own businesses would represent, and he could no longer convince himself that the story he had accepted 3 years earlier was the whole truth. The following Monday began with bright sunshine pouring through the bakery windows, illuminating tiny clouds of flour that floated through the air like drifting snow. Ava had barely finished arranging the morning pastries when a teenage boy rushed inside carrying a backpack with a broken zipper and a worried expression. He counted a handful of dollar bills twice before quietly asking how much a sandwich and a loaf of bread would cost. Ava smiled warmly, rang up a single sandwich, and slipped the fresh loaf into the bag without saying a word. "Your total is $5, she said gently. The boy looked confused, knowing the price should have been much higher, but he accepted the bag with grateful eyes before hurrying toward school. Daniel happened to witness the entire exchange from his usual corner table. After the boy left, he approached the register and asked quietly, "You gave him the bread?" Ava nodded while wiping flour from the counter. "His mother is recovering from surgery. He has been taking care of his younger sister before school every morning. They need breakfast more than I need another sale." Before Daniel could respond, the front door opened again. A firefighter entered with soot still visible on his boots after a long overnight shift. Ava greeted him by name, poured a fresh cup of coffee, and handed him a warm blueberry muffin. When he reached for his wallet, she shook her head with a smile. "You already paid for it yesterday by showing up when someone needed help." The firefighter thanked her quietly before taking a seat near the window. Daniel watched every interaction without interruption. There was no publicity, no camera, no attempt to impress anyone. The generosity was simply part of the bakery, woven into its daily routine as naturally as the smell of fresh bread. As the lunch crowd arrived, a delivery driver accidentally dropped an entire tray of fresh dinner rolls near the entrance. Several customers gasped as the bread scattered across the floor. Before the young driver could apologize, Ava knelt beside him and helped gather the empty trays with calm efficiency. "Accidents happen," she said kindly. "Let us bake another batch together." The young man looked embarrassed. "The company will charge me for the loss." Ava smiled reassuringly. "Then they will never know this batch existed because we are going to make a better one." She led him into the kitchen, tied an extra apron around his waist, and patiently showed him how to shape dough. Laughter soon replaced his anxiety as the warm kitchen filled with the comforting scent of rising bread. Daniel remained where he was, listening to the quiet conversations around him. One customer leaned toward another and whispered, "She helped my daughter find her first job." Another replied, "She organized free baking classes for the neighborhood kids every Saturday." An elderly woman added with quiet pride, "When my husband passed away last winter, she brought dinner to my house every evening for 2 weeks without ever telling anyone." Daniel realized none of these stories had come from Ava herself. They lived only in the grateful memories of ordinary people whose lives she had quietly touched. He looked toward the kitchen window where Ava was encouraging the nervous delivery driver after another imperfect loaf. She never raised her voice. She simply smiled and said, "Bread teaches patience because it rises in its own time. People do too." Those simple words settled heavily in Daniel's heart. For years he had believed leadership meant demanding excellence. Watching Ava, he began to understand that true leadership could also mean creating a place where people believed they deserved another chance. And that quiet lesson carried far more weight than any success he had ever measured on a financial report. Late that afternoon, after the last customers had drifted home carrying warm boxes tied with simple brown string, Daniel returned to his office for the first time in days with a single question he could no longer ignore. He asked his longtime operations director to retrieve every archived file connected to the inventory investigation from 3 years earlier. The request surprised everyone. The case had been considered closed for years, and the restaurants had long since moved forward. Within an hour, several thick storage boxes covered his conference table. Old invoices, supplier receipts, employee schedules, handwritten delivery logs, and security reports sat untouched beneath a thin layer of dust. Daniel opened each folder slowly, reading far more carefully than he ever had before. This time he noticed details that had somehow escaped him years earlier. Several receiving forms had been signed after Ava's shift officially ended. Security records showed another manager entering the storage room long after she had already clocked out. Most troubling of all, a series of inventory corrections carried initials that did not belong to her. Daniel frowned as he continued turning page after page. The story he had accepted without hesitation suddenly no longer fit the evidence lying in front of him. Just before sunset, his retired regional manager, Harold Mitchell, agreed to meet him over coffee. Harold had left the company only months after Ava's dismissal, and his memory remained remarkably sharp. When Daniel mentioned Ava's name, the older man's expression changed immediately. He rested his coffee cup on the table and released a slow breath. "I always wondered when you would ask about her," he said quietly. Daniel leaned forward. "There is something I missed, is there not?" Harold nodded. "More than something." He explained that another kitchen supervisor had privately admitted weeks after Ava left that several delivery records had been altered to hide repeated inventory mistakes. Fear of losing a promotion kept employees silent, while responsibility quietly settled on the newest senior cook who had no influential connections inside the company. Harold had planned to reopen the investigation, but before he gathered enough documentation, the supervisor resigned unexpectedly and moved out of state. Without a formal complaint or complete records, the issue slowly disappeared beneath newer business priorities. Daniel sat motionless as every word settled into place. "Why did nobody tell me?" he asked softly. Harold looked at him with honest sadness. "Because everyone believed you had already made up your mind. You moved quickly, too quickly. People assumed you did not want the decision questioned." Silence filled the room. Daniel lowered his eyes toward the untouched coffee growing cold beside him. For years he had considered himself decisive, believing swift judgment reflected strong leadership. Now that same confidence felt painfully close to carelessness. His memory returned to Ava standing quietly in his office, trying to explain incomplete signatures while he barely looked up from the paperwork. She had not demanded sympathy. She had only asked to be heard. He had never given her that chance. As darkness settled beyond the restaurant windows, Daniel remained seated long after Harold departed. He reached into his briefcase and unfolded the empty brown paper wrapper from the loaf he had purchased that morning. The bakery logo was still visible above the words, "Everyone deserves a fresh start." For the first time since discovering the truth, those words no longer seemed directed toward Ava alone. They had quietly become a question he could no longer avoid asking himself. The following morning, Daniel arrived before sunrise carrying no briefcase, no assistants, and no carefully prepared speech. The streets were still quiet as the first hints of golden light reflected across the bakery windows. Inside, Ava was already working. She stood beside the large wooden table, gently folding dough with steady hands while soft jazz played from an old radio resting near the coffee machine. The comforting aroma of butter and fresh yeast filled every corner of the room. She glanced toward the door as the familiar bell rang, but returned her attention to the dough without surprise. Daniel stepped forward slowly, holding nothing except a folded envelope. For several moments, neither of them spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable. It simply carried the weight of everything that had been left unsaid for 3 long years. Finally, Daniel placed the envelope on the counter. "I reopened your case," he said quietly. Ava continued shaping the dough before placing each loaf into its baking pan with careful precision. "I know," she replied calmly. Daniel looked surprised. "How?" Ava smiled faintly without looking up. "People talk, especially when someone important starts asking questions about something everyone else tried to forget." Daniel lowered his eyes. "They were wrong. The reports were wrong. I was wrong." The words seemed almost unfamiliar as they left his mouth. Throughout his career, he had negotiated impossible business deals, and spoken confidently before thousands of people. Yet those 3 simple sentences required more courage than any public speech he had ever given. Ava wiped a light dusting of flour from her hands before finally meeting his eyes. She saw no pride in his expression, no attempt to defend himself, only quiet regret. Daniel slid the envelope toward her. Everything the company owes you is inside. Lost wages, interest, and an ownership offer for one of my flagship restaurants. It belongs to you if you want it. Ava looked down at the unopened envelope, but made no move to touch it. After a long moment, she gently pushed it back across the counter. No, thank you. Daniel blinked, clearly unprepared for the answer. Please read it first. She shook her head with a peaceful smile. I do not need to know the number. You earned it. Perhaps. She rested both hands lightly on the polished wood between them. But I did not build this bakery so I could go back to the life I left behind. Daniel searched her face, struggling to understand. I cannot change what happened. No, Ava answered softly. Neither of us can. She looked around the bakery as the first rays of sunlight warmed the shelves lined with fresh bread waiting for the neighborhood to wake. But every morning I unlock this door, I remember that my future no longer depends on the worst day of my past. The bell above the entrance chimed as the first customer arrived, a retired schoolteacher who smiled warmly at Ava before taking her usual seat by the window. Ava greeted her by name as naturally as breathing before returning her attention to Daniel. You asked for forgiveness without actually saying the word, she said gently. That matters more than you realize. But forgiveness is not a business transaction. It cannot be purchased with opportunities, titles, or checks. Daniel slowly nodded, understanding each word more deeply than he wished. He reached for the envelope, slipping it back into his coat pocket without argument. For the first time in years, a door had closed in front of him, not because of anger, but because someone had finally discovered a life too meaningful to exchange for anything he could offer. As another customer entered carrying a smiling little girl eager to choose her favorite cinnamon roll, Daniel quietly stepped aside, allowing them to reach the counter before him. Without realizing it, the man who had once expected the world to move around his decisions had begun learning something far more valuable. He was finally learning how to wait. Over the next several weeks, the bakery settled into a comforting rhythm that seemed to mirror the heartbeat of the neighborhood itself. Every morning the lights glowed before sunrise. Every afternoon the display shelves emptied faster than Ava expected, and every evening someone lingered over one last cup of coffee because they were never rushed toward the door. Daniel continued to visit, but something about those visits had quietly changed. He no longer arrived expecting answers. He simply stood in line like everyone else, waiting patiently for his turn. Some mornings he carried fresh flowers for the front windows after noticing the old arrangement beginning to fade. Other days he arrived with nothing more than a smile and an order for the same country loaf that had first brought him back through the bakery door. Ava accepted every order with the same calm professionalism she offered every customer. She neither encouraged nor discouraged his presence. She simply allowed time to do the work that words never could. One windy Thursday afternoon, heavy rain swept across the city without warning. Water leaked steadily through a small crack in the bakery ceiling near the seating area, forcing customers to move their tables while Ava hurried to place buckets beneath the dripping water. She climbed a small ladder to inspect the damage, but one glance told her the aging roof needed more than a temporary repair. Replacing it would cost far more than the bakery could comfortably afford during its first season. She quietly wrote down the estimate from a local contractor, folded the paper into her apron pocket, and returned to serving customers as though nothing had happened. Late that evening, after the bakery had closed, Daniel happened to walk past the building and noticed a single light still glowing inside. Through the window, he saw Ava standing alone beneath the leaking ceiling with a mop in one hand and a bucket in the other. She worked without frustration, simply wiping away each puddle before it spread across the wooden floor. He stepped inside and looked toward the water stains forming overhead. "May I help?" he asked softly. Ava handed him a dry towel without hesitation. For nearly an hour they worked side by side in comfortable silence, drying tables, moving chairs, and protecting the shelves from the slow drip of rainwater. Neither mentioned the past. Neither spoke about apologies or mistakes. They simply shared the work. When everything was finally clean, Daniel glanced once more toward the damaged ceiling. I know people who can replace the entire roof by tomorrow, he offered. Ava smiled gratefully, but shook her head. I appreciate that, but this bakery has survived because neighbors help neighbors. If I let one powerful person solve every problem, I would lose the very community that gave this place its life. Daniel considered her answer carefully before nodding. The next morning, a handwritten flyer appeared on the bakery bulletin board announcing a neighborhood volunteer repair day the following Saturday. Ava never discovered who quietly arranged for lumber to be delivered at cost, who persuaded a local hardware store to donate paint, or who convinced several skilled contractors to spend their weekend helping without charging labor. By sunrise on Saturday, teachers, firefighters, retired carpenters, college students, and longtime customers filled Maple Street carrying ladders, tool belts, paintbrushes, and trays of homemade cookies. Daniel stood among them wearing blue jeans, work gloves, and an old baseball cap that made him almost unrecognizable. He followed instructions, carried lumber, swept sawdust, and thanked every volunteer who showed up. No one treated him like the most influential man in the neighborhood. They simply treated him like another pair of willing hands. As Ava watched the community laugh together beneath the bright autumn sky, while the old bakery slowly became stronger than before, she realized that some foundations were not built from brick or timber at all. They were built from humility, shared purpose, and people quietly choosing to lift one another without expecting anything in return. 1 year later, Maple Street looked different. Flower boxes overflowed beneath freshly restored windows. Children laughed outside the bakery every Saturday morning during free baking classes, and the old brick building that so many people once ignored had quietly become the heart of the neighborhood. The chalkboard near the entrance had changed with the seasons, but one message never disappeared. Everyone deserves a fresh start. Customers often paused to read it before stepping inside, unaware that the sentence carried the weight of 2 lives forever changed. Ava unlocked the front door just before sunrise as she always did, greeting familiar faces long before they reached the counter. Teachers stopped in for coffee before class. Hospital nurses picked up breakfast after overnight shifts. Retirees lingered over cinnamon rolls while discussing baseball scores and grandchildren. The bakery no longer belonged only to Ava. It belonged to everyone who had found comfort within its warm walls. At precisely 8 o'clock, the brass bell above the entrance rang once again. Daniel stepped inside carrying no flowers, no envelopes, and no expensive gifts. He simply joined the line behind several neighbors, patiently waiting his turn while chatting politely with the elderly couple standing ahead of him. No one stepped aside because of his reputation. No one hurried the line for his convenience. He seemed perfectly content with that. When he finally reached the register, Ava greeted him with the same calm smile she had offered every customer since opening day. Good morning. What can I get for you today? Daniel glanced toward the display case before answering with a quiet smile. The country loaf, please. And 2 cinnamon rolls for the firefighters across the street. Ava wrapped the bread carefully in fresh brown paper, placed the warm pastries into a small box, and handed everything across the counter. That will be $18. Daniel counted the bills himself, accepted the change, and thanked her sincerely. There were no dramatic speeches, no grand declarations, just 2 people speaking with the quiet respect that had taken an entire year to earn. Before leaving, Daniel paused near the community bulletin board where dozens of handwritten notes thanked the bakery for birthday cakes, warm meals, job referrals, and simple acts of kindness that had helped people through difficult seasons. His eyes settled on one anonymous message written in careful blue ink. Thank you for reminding me that being seen can change a life. He smiled softly before turning toward the door. You built something remarkable, he said. Ava looked around the busy bakery, listening to the conversations, laughter, and gentle hum of the ovens filling the room with warmth. No, she answered quietly. We built it together. Not with money. With trust. Daniel nodded once, understanding exactly what she meant. Outside, the morning sun stretched across Maple Street as neighbors waved to one another carrying warm bags of bread back to their homes. Daniel crossed the street, then glanced back through the bakery window one last time. Ava was laughing with a little girl who proudly held her first perfectly shaped dinner roll while her grandfather watched with tears of quiet pride. Daniel smiled, not because the past had disappeared, but because he finally understood it no longer had the final word. Some people rebuild their lives to prove others wrong. Others rebuild them so that kindness always has a place to live. And on that quiet street, inside a bakery filled with the comforting aroma of fresh bread and second chances, everyone who walked through the door left carrying something far greater than a loaf. They carried the simple reminder that dignity grows strongest wherever humility is willing to rise.